Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis in 1993 became the game that changed the industry forever. While Nintendo released a censored version with gray sweat instead of blood, Sega included the famous blood code A, B, A, C, A, B, B. This code unlocked the full arcade experience with red blood, brutal fatalities, and spine-ripping finishing moves that made the game notorious. The violence caught the attention of Senators Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl, who organized congressional hearings in December of 1993, specifically citing Mortal Kombat and Night Trap as examples of excessive violence in video games. Sega of America's Bill White testified that the company supported a rating system but argued parents should make purchasing decisions. The hearings featured footage of Sub-Zero's spine-rip fatality and Kano's heart-rip move, with senators expressing shock at the graphic content being marketed to children. The controversy directly led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board in 1994. Sega's decision to include the blood code proved commercially successful, with the Genesis version significantly outselling the censored Super Nintendo version. The game proved that mature content could drive sales, but it also forced the entire industry to adopt age ratings. This single title fundamentally altered how video games would be marketed, sold, and regulated for decades to come. Night Trap. Night Trap for Sega CD launched in October of 1992 as a full-motion video game where players monitored security cameras to protect teenage girls from vampiric creatures called augurs. Senator Lieberman singled out the game during the 1993 hearings, specifically condemning a scene where the character Lisa is captured in a nightgown, calling it violence against women. Sega pulled the game from stores in December of 1993 under congressional pressure, despite it being one of the Sega CD's better-selling titles. The controversy was partly based on misunderstanding, as senators described scenes that weren't actually in the game or mischaracterized the player's role as attacking rather than defending the characters. Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske personally ordered the game's removal to demonstrate the company's willingness to self-regulate. The game received an MA-17 rating when the ESRB formed, one of the first games to receive a mature rating, despite its relatively tame content by today's standards. Night Trap was re-released in 1994 after the rating system launched, but the damage was done to both the game's reputation and Sega CD sales. The game has since been re-released multiple times, including a 25th anniversary edition in 2017, with creator James Riley defending the game as misunderstood. What seemed scandalous in 1992 now appears quaint, but it remains a symbol of moral panic around gaming. Lethal Enforcers. Konami's Lethal Enforcers arrived on Genesis in 1993 with the Justifier Light Gun, a realistic gray pistol peripheral that immediately drew criticism. The game featured digitized graphics of criminals being shot, with blood sprays and wounded animations that looked photorealistic compared to other Genesis titles. Senator Lieberman specifically mentioned the game during hearings, noting that children were using realistic-looking guns to shoot digitized human targets. After the controversy erupted, Konami redesigned the Justifier gun from gray to bright orange and red to make it look less like a real firearm. Toys R Us and other major retailers initially refused to stock the game with the gray gun, fearing it promoted gun violence or could be mistaken for a real weapon. The game required players to shoot criminals, bank robbers, and terrorists in locations like banks and chemical plants, with a scoring system that rewarded headshots and rapid kills. Law enforcement groups joined the criticism, arguing the game desensitized children to gun violence and taught poor firearm safety. The combination of realistic violence and realistic gun peripheral made Lethal Enforcers a perfect target for anti-gaming activists. Despite the controversy, the game sold well enough to receive a sequel, though light gun games would face increasing scrutiny throughout the 90s. The orange and red gun redesign became a symbol of the industry's response to public pressure, changing aesthetics without changing content. Eternal Champions. Sega's Eternal Champions launched in December of 1993 as a direct competitor to Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II, but it pushed violence even further. The game featured overkills, fatality-style finishing moves where characters died in stage-specific deaths like being mauled by a monster, crushed in a printing press, or electrocuted on a fence. These weren't just violent, they were elaborately animated deaths that lasted several seconds and showed detailed destruction of the human body. The game received a mature rating from the newly formed ESRB, making it one of the first major Genesis releases to carry the rating. Parent groups specifically cited the overkill, where Shadow is eaten alive by sharks, with visible blood clouding the water, as an example of excessive violence marketed to teenagers. Sega found itself in the awkward position of being criticized for content in its own first-party title after testifying about responsible content creation just months earlier. The Sega CD version released in 1995 included even more extreme overkills, including one where a character is ground up in machinery, and another involving a circular saw. Critics argued Sega was hypocritical for criticizing third-party violence, while publishing games that matched or exceeded those titles in brutality. The franchise died after 1995, partly because Sega struggled to balance its corporate stance on violence with its desire to compete in the mature gaming market. Streets of Rage 3. Streets of Rage 3 faced controversy before it even released in the West. The Japanese version, Bare Knuckle 3, featured a character named Ash, a flamboyant male fighter in crop top and pants, who represented early LGBTQ representation in fighting games. Sega of America completely removed Ash from the Western release in 1994, citing concerns about American market reception to the character's appearance and mannerisms. The censorship sparked backlash from players who imported the Japanese version and discovered the character removal. Gaming magazines at the time noted the missing character, though coverage often used insensitive language common in 90s game journalism. The game also featured Roo, a boxing kangaroo character, who remained in both versions but couldn't compensate for the removed playable fighter. The controversy extends beyond just character removal. The entire Western version was made significantly harder, enemy and item placements were changed, and multiple endings were altered. The bad ending in the Japanese version shows the heroes failing and the city burning, but this was changed to a non-canon joke ending in the American release. The combination of censorship and gameplay changes meant Western players received an inferior, modified version based on cultural sensitivity concerns that wouldn't be widely questioned until years later. Modern re-releases have restored Ash, acknowledging the original censorship as a mistake. Splatterhouse 2. Namco's Splatterhouse 2, released in August of 1992, continuing the horror franchise with even more graphic content than the TurboGrafx original. The game featured the terror mask-wearing Rick, fighting through levels filled with grotesque monsters, with combat that showed severed limbs, exposed organs, and creatures splitting apart in detailed sprite work. Enemies included mutated fetuses, skinless dogs, and human-monster hybrids that died in pools of blood. Multiple rental chains, including some blockbuster locations, refused to stock the game due to its horror content and graphic violence. The game's cover art featured the iconic white terror mask splattered with blood, making it immediately identifiable as mature content, even on rental shelves. Namco leaned into the controversy, with magazine advertisements emphasizing the game's horror elements and violent gameplay as selling points to teenage audiences. By the way, if you're into gaming history like this, I make videos covering these topics all the time. Subscribing would really mean a lot. Parent groups criticized the game's detailed gore, arguing that the Genesis's improved graphics made the violence more realistic and disturbing than the original game. The combination of horror movie aesthetics, religious imagery including crosses and possession themes, and extreme violence made Splatterhouse 2 a frequent target. Despite, or because of the controversy, the game sold well enough to warrant Splatterhouse 3 in 1993, though the franchise would remain controversial throughout its existence. Bare Knuckle Origins. Before Streets of Rage 3's controversy, the original Streets of Rage faced its own censorship issues during localization from the Japanese Bare Knuckle in 1991. The original Japanese version featured more revealing outfits for the female character Blaze, along with different enemy designs that were altered for Western audiences. Sega modified Blaze's clothing to be less form-fitting and changed several background elements that featured alcohol and tobacco references. The changes were made preemptively by Sega of America to avoid potential retail pushback, demonstrating the company's early awareness of content sensitivity. Enemy characters who smoked or held beer bottles in the Japanese version had these items removed or replaced with more neutral objects. The alterations were subtle enough that most players didn't notice, but side-by-side comparisons reveal dozens of small changes throughout the game. These modifications established a pattern that would continue throughout the Streets of Rage series, with each subsequent game receiving varying degrees of censorship. The practice reflected Sega's attempt to position itself as family-friendly while still appealing to older gamers. The original Streets of Rage changes were minor compared to later series entries, but they set precedents for how Sega would handle content localization throughout the Genesis era. General Chaos. EA's General Chaos launched in November of 1993, right as the ESRB was being formed, creating a test case for cartoon violence ratings. The game featured cute, chibi-style soldiers fighting in comedic battles, but they still shot, stabbed, and exploded each other with weapons ranging from rifles to flamethrowers. The disconnect between the adorable art style and the violent gameplay created debate about whether stylized violence deserved the same ratings as realistic violence. The game received a teen rating from the ESRB despite featuring characters being set on fire, blown apart by grenades, and machine-gunned in exaggerated death animations. Parents argued that the cartoon style made violence more appealing to younger children, while the industry countered that stylization reduced the impact of violent content. Sega used general chaos as an example of why context and presentation mattered in rating decisions during early ESRB discussions. The controversy never reached congressional attention, but sparked internal industry debates about rating criteria that continue today. Should cartoon violence be rated the same as photorealistic violence? The game's commercial reception was mixed, partly because its teen rating kept it from younger audiences, while its cutesy style didn't appeal to mature gamers seeking realistic combat. General chaos represents the complicated middle ground where art style and content clash in rating discussions. Moonwalker. Sega's Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, released for Genesis in August of 1990, based on the 1988 film, featuring Jackson saving children from the villain Mr. Big. The game became controversial years after release, when the first public allegations of child abuse against Jackson emerged in 1993. The game's premise of Jackson rescuing kids hidden throughout levels took on disturbing implications that Sega never intended during development. The controversy placed retailers in an uncomfortable position regarding existing stock of a game that had been unremarkable for 3 years. Some stores quietly removed the game from shelves not due to official policy, but because staff and customers found the child rescue theme uncomfortable given the allegations. Sega never officially pulled the game, and it continued selling in markets where Jackson's controversies received less attention, particularly in Europe and Japan. The licensing situation became complicated as Jackson's legal troubles continued, with Sega unable to re-release the game on compilation collections due to both licensing costs and reputational concerns. The game represents a unique case where controversy emerged not from content, but from real-world events surrounding the licensed personality. Modern retro gaming communities debate whether the game should be preserved as historical artifact or whether Jackson's alleged crimes make the game inappropriate regardless of when it was created. The game remains officially unavailable on modern platforms, stuck in legal and ethical limbo. Zero Tolerance. Accolade's Zero Tolerance launched in March of 1994 as one of the first first-person shooters on a home console, bringing Doom-style gameplay to Genesis. The game featured squad-based combat where players controlled elite soldiers, fighting terrorists in locations including embassies and underground bases. The violence was notable for its detail, with enemies bleeding, falling realistically, and leaving bodies that remained visible throughout levels. The game's realistic violence and first-person perspective raised concerns among parent groups about whether this type of immersive combat was appropriate for home consoles. The game received a teen rating despite its violence, which sparked debate about whether first-person perspective made violence more impactful than third-person games with similar content. Critics pointed to the detailed death animations and persistent corpses as evidence that FPS games brought arcade-style violence too close to reality. The game's instruction manual included tactical information about weapons and combat situations, with detailed descriptions of firearms and military tactics. The combination of educational, weapon information, and violent gameplay created an uncomfortable mix that some critics argued crossed from entertainment into something resembling training material. Zero Tolerance sold modestly, but demonstrated that FPS violence would remain controversial regardless of platform, setting the stage for later debates about Doom, Quake, and other landmark shooters. Phantasy Star 4. Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, released in December of 1994 in Japan and February of 1995 in North America, but the Western version underwent significant religious censorship. The Japanese version featured Christian crosses in several locations, including a church, religious NPCs wearing crosses, and healing spells that displayed cross symbols. Sega of America removed or altered all Christian imagery, changing crosses to generic symbols and rewriting dialogue to remove religious references. The censorship sparked outrage among RPG fans who felt religious content was being unfairly targeted, while violence and action games received less scrutiny. The game's church was redesigned as a generic healing house, and the priest characters were changed to non-religious healers. Even the revival spell animation, which showed a cross in the Japanese version, was altered to show generic sparkles in the American release. Religious groups had mixed reactions. Some Christian organizations appreciated Sega removing religious symbols from a game with magic and fantasy elements, violence, arguing that mixing Christianity with fantasy was disrespectful. Other religious gamers argued the censorship itself was offensive, treating religious imagery as more dangerous than violence. The controversy highlighted America's complicated relationship with religious content in entertainment, where religious imagery was simultaneously protected and censored depending on context. The issue would repeat across multiple Japanese RPGs localized in the 90s, establishing a pattern of religious censorship in Western game releases. Contra Hard Corps. Konami's Contra Hard Corps launched in August of 1994 in Japan as Contra, the Hard Corps, and September in North America, but the Western version received major difficulty changes alongside content alterations. The Japanese version included multiple story branches, darker narrative elements, including character deaths, and a life system allowing continues. The American version removed the life system entirely, forcing players to complete the game without dying once, and altered story elements to reduce violence references. The game's violence was intense for a Genesis title, with detailed sprite work showing explosions, robots being destroyed, and alien creatures being blasted apart. Combined with the weapon variety, including flamethrowers and laser weapons, the game pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable even with stylized graphics. The game received a kids to adults rating from the ESRB, one of the early examples of the rating that would later become everyone. The difficulty changes were specifically made because Konami felt American players expected harder games and wanted to remove the easy perception of having multiple lives. This backfired spectacularly, as hardcore became notorious for being nearly impossible, with most players unable to progress past the first few stages. The combination of extreme difficulty and moderate violence created controversy from both gameplay and content perspectives. Speedrunners and hardcore gamers later celebrated the challenge, but casual audiences found the game frustratingly inaccessible, with many never experiencing the branching storylines locked behind the punishing difficulty. Splatterhouse 3. Splatterhouse 3, released in March of 1993, pushing the horror franchise's violence to new extremes on Genesis hardware. Unlike the side-scrolling predecessors, this entry used an isometric viewpoint and featured Rick fighting through his own house to save his family from monsters. The game included a real-time element where players had limited time to save Rick's wife and son, with graphic death scenes showing family members being killed if players failed. The addition of family peril elevated controversy beyond previous entries. Parent groups objected to the game showing a wife and child in danger, with failure resulting in their on-screen deaths. The game's depiction of home invasion by monsters resonated differently than arcade or urban settings, bringing horror directly into a domestic space. Critics argued this made the violence more personal and disturbing than typical action game scenarios. The game also featured more detailed gore than Splatterhouse 2, with improved Genesis hardware, allowing for larger, more detailed enemy sprites that died in increasingly grotesque ways. The terror mask's transformations gave Rick monstrous appearance changes, including one form with exposed bone and muscle tissue. Combined with the family danger element and graphic violence, Splatterhouse 3 represented the horror franchise at its most controversial, though it arrived after the ESRB's formation and received an appropriate mature rating that limited mainstream criticism. If you enjoyed this look at Sega's controversial history, consider subscribing so you don't miss future gaming content. Thanks for watching.